For the time we have together on this occasion, I'd like to start with a couple of verses in the Old Testament book of Isaiah, and then look at some things written in the Old Testament book of Proverbs, especially the way they relate to situations in our modern culture. In Isaiah chapter 5, verses 20 and 21. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. The warning is something that could be spoken today as much as millennia ago. Humanity in many regards really hasn't changed. In fact, before we take a look at some statements in Proverbs chapter 18, I want to talk about something that was written in a medical journal back in 1980 from a doctor who was associated then with the University of Wisconsin. She actually was involved in terminating the life of unborn children. And this is what she said. Parents are asked if they wish to see and hold the fetus. Frequently they do. And whether they wish to receive photographs as well as copies of the autopsy report. After discharge, communication is maintained to provide and ensure support during the grieving process. This has been going on for centuries, but it's nothing new. In fact, an archaeologist at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem makes this observation about things in the past. Infanticide was widely practiced by the Greeks and the Romans. It was regarded as the parent's right if they didn't want a child. Usually they killed the girls. The boys were seen as more valuable. And if you go back and research what actually happened in the past, in Sparta, the first thing a family did when that child was born, the father actually examined the baby. If there was any sign of any kind of physical defect, or if there was the thought that there may be something mentally that might be wrong with the child, that infant was thrown off a cliff. Now, in other Greek cities that were not quite so violently oriented, unwanted children were left in the marketplace, maybe with a hope that some poor family would pick up that child, or some rich family would see it and actually take it as a slave. Other families in those less violent cities than those in the region of Sparta may simply go out into the woods or the fields and leave that infant for nature to take its course, whether by scavenging animals or just the elements of nature itself. Times haven't changed. Humanity is something that, no matter how they wish to elevate themselves, really ultimately fall back into some problematic areas. And there's some reasons for that. In Proverbs chapter 18, the chapter begins this way. A man who isolates himself seeks his own desire. He rages against all wise judgment. It doesn't sound like there's a great deal of intelligence involved in that kind of action. In verse 2, a fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart. The opinionated individual that bases none of those opinions or conclusions on any data other than what he or she feels is correct. No investigation, no look other than to yourself for those kind of answers. Then in verse number 5, it is not good to show partiality to the wicked or to overthrow the righteous in judgment. And there are people in every generation, and it seems like there's an epidemic of that in our culture, people that have no ability to listen to all sides of a particular point of view, to discuss pros and cons, or even to consider that they may be incorrect, or maybe there's an alternative that they have never investigated as of yet, nor do they intend to. Then in verse number 6 and 7, a fool's lips enter into contention, his mouth calls for blows. A fool's mouth is his destruction, and his lips are the snare of his soul. He's calling for violence. And violence never really is something that is instigated by those who are the intelligent part of society, is it? Isn't violence something that's relegated to those who cannot support their point of view? And you see the kind of violence in our culture, and you have for years. Down in verse number 13, he who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. Individuals that reach conclusions basically based on ignorance, they're not interested in all of the details, and it's an emotional kind of response rather than an intellectual or intelligent kind of response. Down in verse number 15, the heart of the prudent acquires knowledge. The ear of the wise seeks knowledge. And it's the idea that those who are really intelligent are not the ones that rush to judgment or the ones that rush to reach conclusions. They're looking at every detail, and they want all of the information before they make any conclusions. Because they realize that to make conclusions, to reach conclusions without all of the evidence is not a sign of intelligence, but just the opposite. Down to verse 17. The first one to plead his cause seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him. Haste in judgment. Haste in judgment, somebody said, is just as bad as corruption itself, just as evil as corruption itself. Haste in judgment as bad as evil and as corrupt as evil. Interesting thought. And yet most people that actually reach judgments without looking at all of the evidence, without investigating all sides of an issue, don't see themselves as evil. But is it really anything less? Ran across some interesting comments. An article, I really don't know the name of the author, but it was an interesting observation. The Enlightenment of the 18th century, with its presumption of man's perfectibility, heralded a social ethic that assumed man was, or at least could be, intrinsically good. But as the centuries continue to unfold, there is a falsehood in that reasoning. By the 20th century, society began to rebel against this modernism, especially after Nazi Germany demonstrated the extreme but consistent culmination of such social Darwinism. In its place, jointly fueled by the political individualism of the democratic thought, came postmodernism and its rejection of objective reality. With postmodernism came the idea that each person could define his own truth and therefore his own reality. It's fed the social revolt against biology and the obsession with finding one's own identity, often in external qualities like race or sex or imagined gender identities. Our culture of victimhood only serves to further the self-preservation ethic. And then this observation. If we believe the highest purpose in our existence is self-discovery, our lives cease to serve any higher purpose than ourselves. It makes sense then that our culture would glorify killing the unborn, because by that paradigm, killing an inconvenient baby is a means of self-empowerment. Why individuals can in complete seriousness advocate for the killing of innocent life, even up to the time of a full-term child? Because it doesn't matter to them that the baby is a living being, or if he or she conflicts with a woman's self-love, because that baby, if it conflicts with the mother's desire, really doesn't desire to live. It's perfectly consistent with our culture's increasingly popular perception of having children as a fulfillment of the parents' want, instead of a responsibility to cherish then require that self-denial and sacrificial love that has got to be present to bring up and raise that child. It kind of sounds like ancient Sparta all over in this modern world in which we live. What was it that stemmed the tide back then? It was recognition of the preciousness of life. That preciousness, that idea of the preciousness of life, continues to erode with a culture and a world that is bent on declaring itself, personhood, as the ultimate goal, the greatest achievement. Morality doesn't exist in the mind of those who see themselves as the ultimate goal of what is definitive in any culture. Calling evil and evil good hasn't stopped. It continues today. Please, please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.